The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned with deceptive tranquility over the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the vast expanse of blue that had become Japan's highway to empire. The salt spray caught the early light, casting diamonds across the deck where his airmen prepared for what they believed would be another decisive victory in their nation's relentless march across the Pacific. Nagumo's fleet was magnificent. 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the same force that had delivered the crushing blow to Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The admiral's confidence was not misplaced. His pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of campaigns from China to the Dutch East Indies. They had tasted victory so often that defeat seemed an impossibility. The plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece, a complex operation designed to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a trap near Midway Atoll. By threatening this strategic outpost, Yamamoto hoped to force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle, where Japan's superior numbers and experience would crush them once and for all. The architect of Pearl Harbor had convinced the Imperial Navy that this would be the knockout punch that would bring America to the negotiating table. As the sun climbed higher, Nagumo received confirmation that the first wave of bombers had launched successfully toward Midway. 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters streaked across the morning sky like a flock of deadly birds. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation, his orders clear. Neutralize Midway's defenses and prepare the way for invasion. The Japanese admiral allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans had only 2 carriers in the area, possibly 3 at most. His 4 carriers could launch over 200 aircraft, nearly double what the Americans could muster. The mathematics of war seemed to favor the rising sun. But mathematics, as Nagumo would soon discover, could not account for the intangibles of warfare: courage, determination, and the desperate fury of men fighting for their homeland. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, the Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, but strategic surprise would prove elusive at Midway. Unknown to Nagumo, American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher weeks earlier. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. Even now, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lay in wait northeast of Midway, their decks packed with aircraft and their crews burning with the desire for revenge. The morning air carried the scent of aviation fuel and the sound of engines warming up. Nagumo checked his watch and calculated the timing. His first wave would hit Midway, suppress its defenses, and return for refueling and rearming. Then would come the second wave, the coup de grace that would reduce the atoll to rubble and clear the way for invasion forces. As the last of the first wave disappeared into the eastern sky, Nagumo turned his attention to the deck below. His Abedzo reserve aircraft sat ready, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship-to-ship combat. These were his insurance policy, his answer to any American naval forces that might appear. The admiral's confidence remained unshaken. After all, what could possibly go wrong with such a perfectly planned operation? The first crack in Admiral Nagumo's confidence appeared at 7:28 that morning when Lieutenant Tominaga's voice crackled over the radio from the lead bomber approaching Midway. The atoll's defenses were stronger than expected, the pilot reported, and a second attack would be necessary to complete the mission. Nagumo frowned as he absorbed this information. The plan called for a single devastating strike that would neutralize Midway's airfields and coastal batteries. 15 minutes later, another radio transmission shattered the morning calm. A Japanese reconnaissance seaplane reported spotting American ships to the northeast, 10 vessels, including what appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo's blood chilled. This was not supposed to happen. American carriers were supposed to be hundreds of miles away, racing to defend Midway only to arrive too late to prevent its capture. The admiral faced a dilemma that would haunt Japanese naval historians for decades. His reserve aircraft were armed with land attack bombs and incendiary weapons, perfect for pulverizing Midway's installations, but useless against warships. If American carriers were indeed lurking nearby, he needed his planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The decision to rearm would cost precious time that might allow the Americans to strike first. As deck crews scrambled to swap ordnance on the reserve aircraft, more disturbing news arrived. American planes from Midway were attacking the Japanese fleet. The first wave consisted of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, launched desperately from Midway's battered airstrips. They came in scattered formations, their pilots displaying more courage than skill as they dove through the murderous crossfire of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu watched these early attacks with professional respect tinged by contempt. The American pilots were brave but untrained, their aircraft inferior to Japanese Zero fighters and Nakajima dive bombers. Most were shot down before they could inflict significant damage, their twisted wreckage joining the sharks that followed the fleet. Yet their sacrifice bought precious minutes for the main American force. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo wrestled with incomplete information and mounting pressure. The reconnaissance plane's report remained frustratingly vague. 10 ships, possibly including a carrier. Was it one carrier or 3? Were they preparing to attack or fleeing the scene? The admiral's staff urged caution, but time was running out. His first wave would return from Midway within the hour, their fuel tanks nearly empty and their aircraft riddled with bullet holes. The moment of truth arrived at 9:18, when a clearer report finally reached the flagship. The American force included not one but multiple carriers, positioned perfectly to launch a coordinated attack. As this news sank in, lookouts spotted the distinctive silhouettes of American torpedo bombers approaching from the east. The Battle of Midway had begun in earnest, and Nagumo realized with growing horror that his perfectly planned operation was disintegrating into chaos. Captain Tomotsu Oishi of the Hiryu ordered his gun crews to battle stations as the first wave of American torpedo bombers began their attack runs. These were Douglas Devastator aircraft from the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, flying in disciplined formations that spoke of professional training and careful preparation. Unlike the desperate pilots from Midway, these men represented the cream of American naval aviation. The Japanese response was swift and deadly. Zero fighters dove from above while anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of flak. The torpedo bombers, flying low and slow to deliver their weapons, presented perfect targets. One by one, they were picked off, their crews dying in flames as their aircraft tumbled into the Pacific. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that began the attack, only 6 survived, and none of their torpedoes found their mark. Yet even as Japanese gunners celebrated their defensive success, a more dangerous threat was approaching unseen. High above the torpedo bombers, American dive bombers from all 3 carriers were positioning themselves for the attack that would change the course of the Pacific War. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes undefended. Admiral Nagumo, focused on the immediate threat, had no idea that his greatest test was about to begin. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of the Enterprise spotted the white wakes of the Japanese fleet cutting through the deep blue Pacific. His squadron of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers had been searching for over an hour, their fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels. McCluskey's decision to extend the search beyond his original orders would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in naval history. From 15,000 feet, the Japanese carriers looked like toys arranged on a blue carpet. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Admiral Nagumo's decision to rearm his reserve planes had created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel lay scattered across the hangar decks, while the carrier's defensive fighters were still climbing back to altitude after the torpedo bomber attacks. McCluskey's radio crackled with the voices of other squadron leaders. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from the Yorktown and Lieutenant Commander Richard Best from the Enterprise reported their positions. 3 American dive bomber squadrons, totaling over 60 aircraft, were converging on the Japanese fleet from different directions. The trap that Admiral Yamamoto had planned for the Americans was about to be sprung in reverse. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagamo watched his fighters engage the last of the American torpedo bombers. The sea around his flagship was littered with the debris of shot-down aircraft, and his gunners were running low on ammunition. The admiral allowed himself a moment of relief. His fleet had survived the coordinated American attack with minimal damage. Perhaps the day could still be salvaged. That moment of optimism died as lookouts screamed warnings of dive bombers approaching from high altitude. Nagumo looked up to see dots against the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. The American Dauntless bombers were diving at 70-degree angles, their engines screaming as they built up speed. Anti-aircraft guns swung toward the sky, but the bombers were already committed to their attack runs. The first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar. The blast set off a chain reaction among the rearmed aircraft, bombs, and fuel lines. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Admiral Nagamo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara as his flagship became uninhabitable. Simultaneously, the Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, the explosions lifting her massive hull partially out of the water. Captain Jisaku Okada fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires spread too quickly. The carrier's ammunition magazines detonated in a pillar of flame that could be seen for 50 miles, taking 800 men to their deaths in the space of minutes. The Soryu, caught in the middle of landing operations, took 2 direct hits that turned her flight deck into a sea of fire. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, his uniform ablaze, ordered his crew to abandon ship before choosing to go down with his vessel. The captain's sacrifice embodied the code of Bushido, but it could not save the experienced air crews who perished in the flames. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 aircraft carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years and fought across the Pacific, died alongside their ships. The tactical advantage that Japan had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor evaporated in the smoke and flames of the stricken carriers. Captain Tomotsu Oishi of the Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, watched the destruction with a mixture of horror and determination. His ship had been operating independently and had escaped the initial dive bomber attacks. Now it fell to him to salvage something from the disaster. The Hiryu still had operational aircraft, and Oishi was determined to make the Americans pay for their success. As the morning wore on, the full scope of the catastrophe became clear to Japanese commanders. The strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was dying in the flames of its own ambition. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship hundreds of miles away, began to comprehend that his master plan had not only failed, but had delivered the very decisive battle he had sought, with the roles of victor and vanquished reversed. Captain Tomotsu Oishi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, and surveyed the apocalyptic scene around him. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned like floating pyres, their smoke columns rising thousands of feet into the tropical sky. The cream of Japanese naval aviation was dying in those flames, but Oishi still had 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters under his command. Honor demanded that he strike back at the Americans who had dealt this devastating blow. At 11:05, Oishi launched his first counterstrike. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the formation of Aichi dive bombers toward the American fleet, their rising sun insignia glinting in the afternoon sun. The Japanese pilots were veterans of countless battles, men who had honed their skills in the crucible of war. If anyone could deliver a telling blow against the American carriers, it would be these experienced airmen. The Americans, flush with their stunning success, were not complacent. Radar operators on the Enterprise and Yorktown tracked the incoming Japanese formation, and fighter directors vectored defending Grumman Wildcats to intercept. The two forces met 30 miles from the American fleet in a swirling dogfight that tested the skill and courage of both sides. Lieutenant Kobayashi's formation pressed through the defensive screen, losing half their number to American fighters, but maintaining their disciplined attack formation. The remaining bombers dove on the Yorktown, their target selected because intelligence indicated she was the most damaged of the American carriers. 3 bombs struck the veteran ship, flooding her forward compartments and knocking out her boilers. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force from the Yorktown's bridge, felt his flagship shudder under the impact of Japanese bombs. Damage control parties raced through smoke-filled corridors, shoring up bulkheads and fighting fires. The carrier's speed dropped to 12 knots, then 6. Then she lay dead in the water. For a moment, it seemed that Japanese skill and determination might yet salvage something from the disaster. But the Yorktown's crew was made of stern stuff. Chief Petty Officer John Vasa led damage control efforts with the calm professionalism that characterized the American response throughout the battle. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and launching aircraft again, a feat of damage control that amazed even Japanese observers. The rising sun's moment of hope flickered and died as the supposedly crippled carrier resumed operations. Captain Oishi, watching from the Hiryu's bridge, prepared his final throw of the dice. At 4:30 in the afternoon, he launched his remaining aircraft, 5 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters, in a desperate attempt to finish off the wounded Yorktown. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto led this second wave, knowing that his fuel supplies were so low that return to the Hiryu was unlikely regardless of the attack's outcome. The American defenders were ready. Combat air patrol fighters, guided by increasingly sophisticated radar, intercepted the Japanese formation before it could reach the carriers. The air battle was brief but vicious, with Zeros and Wildcats twisting through the sky in deadly embraces. Only 2 Japanese torpedo bombers survived to make their attack runs on the Yorktown. Those 2 aircraft, piloted by men who knew they were flying to their deaths, pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. Their torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that finally forced her abandonment. The Japanese pilots, their fuel exhausted and their aircraft shot full of holes, flew into the sea rather than be captured. As Alcatraz, the sun began to set on June 4th, Captain Oishi faced the inevitable. His last attack had succeeded in crippling the Yorktown, but at the cost of his remaining aircraft. The Hiryu floated alone among the burning hulks of her sister ships, defenseless and doomed. American dive bombers from the Enterprise were already approaching for the coup de grace. The end came swiftly. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a furnace. Captain Oishi, like his fellow captains before him, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of surrender. The last of Admiral Nagumo's carriers slipped beneath the waves just after dawn on June 5th, taking with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed the full magnitude of Japan's naval catastrophe. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship, the massive battleship Yamato, and contemplated the radio reports that had been streaming in throughout the night. 4 aircraft carriers sunk, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and nearly 3,000 experienced aircrew dead or missing. The mobile force that had been the sword of Japanese naval power had been broken in a single day. The architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a shroud. Yamamoto had gambled everything on the Midway operation, convinced that one decisive battle could force America to negotiate a favorable peace. Instead, he had delivered his finest ships and most experienced pilots into a carefully prepared trap. The American codebreakers had read his plans, like an open book, and Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his forces with surgical precision. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, stood beside his mentor in stunned silence. Genda had warned against dividing Japanese forces, had argued for concentrating maximum strength against the American carriers. Now his fears had been vindicated in the most terrible way possible. The combined fleet's air power, built up over decades of careful training and combat experience, had been destroyed in a morning's work. The human cost was staggering. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu, and Captain Tomotsu Oishi of the Hiryu had all chosen death over dishonor, going down with their ships in the finest traditions of the Imperial Navy. Their sacrifice embodied the code of Bushido, but it could not restore the lost carriers or resurrect the dead pilots who had been the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the first attack on Midway, was among the missing. His formation had returned from the atoll to find their carriers burning and no place to land. Some pilots ditched in the ocean near friendly destroyers, but many others simply flew until their fuel ran out, choosing the sea over capture. The veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Dutch East Indies died as heroes, but their deaths left gaps in Japanese capabilities that could never be filled. Admiral Nagumo, transferred to a cruiser after the loss of his flagship, contemplated the tactical decisions that had led to disaster. The choice to rearm his reserve aircraft, the delay in launching a coordinated strike, the failure to maintain adequate reconnaissance. Each decision had seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively, they had created the conditions for catastrophe. The Americans had taken advantage of every Japanese mistake with ruthless efficiency. The strategic implications were even more devastating than the tactical defeat. Japan's industrial capacity could eventually replace the lost ships, but the experienced pilots were irreplaceable. It took years to train a competent carrier pilot, and the dead air crews of Midway represented decades of accumulated expertise. The Imperial Navy would never again possess the qualitative advantage that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. As news of the defeat spread through the combined fleet, Admiral Yamamoto made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Rather than press the attack with his remaining battleships and cruisers, he ordered a general withdrawal. The element of surprise was lost. American land-based aircraft were swarming from multiple directions, and his fleet was scattered and demoralized. Discretion, in this case, proved to be the better part of valor. The withdrawal from Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The empire that had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months now found itself on the defensive, forced to fortify scattered island garrisons and hope that American industrial might could not overcome the advantages of interior lines and defensive positions. The tide of war had turned in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on the morning of June 4th. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's leadership struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat. Official communiques spoke of a tactical withdrawal and strategic repositioning, but the truth could not be hidden from those who understood naval warfare. Japan had suffered its greatest naval defeat since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and the path to victory in the Pacific War had become infinitely more difficult. The flames of Midway had consumed more than ships and aircraft. They had burned away the illusion of Japanese invincibility and revealed the limits of what courage and skill could accomplish against superior intelligence, better tactics, and industrial might. The admirals who had found glory in the attack on Pearl Harbor had discovered their limitations in the fires of Midway Atoll. 3 months after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the Yamato, studying intelligence, reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Japan's strategic position. The Americans had not waited to consolidate their victory at Midway. They had immediately gone on the offensive, landing Marines on Guadalcanal and beginning the long, bloody campaign that would eventually carry them to Tokyo Bay. The loss of the 4 fleet carriers had created a void in Japanese naval capabilities that would take years to fill, years that Japan did not have. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, remained operational, but they were insufficient to counter the growing American carrier fleet. Even worse, the replacement pilots being trained in Japan lacked the experience and skill of the men who had died at Midway. Commander Minoru Genda, now assigned to training duties, watched the new pilots with growing despair. These young men were brave and eager, but they had neither the time nor the resources to reach the proficiency of their predecessors. Flight training had been shortened, fuel was increasingly scarce, and the quality of aviation gasoline was declining as Japan's war economy came under strain. The empire was trying to fight an industrial war with cottage industry resources. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Americans. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the Midway victory, was building a fleet that dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. New Essex-class carriers were sliding down American shipways at a rate of 1 per month, each one larger and more capable than the carriers Japan had lost. The industrial capacity that Japanese leaders had hoped to avoid confronting was now fully mobilized for war. Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's former chief of staff, had survived the battle and now served in the Naval General Staff. He understood, better than most, how completely the strategic picture had changed. Japan's early conquests had been achieved through tactical superiority and operational surprise, but both advantages had been squandered at Midway. The Americans had learned to fight with Japanese efficiency while retaining their industrial superiority. The human cost continued to mount as Japan was forced onto the defensive. The pilots who had survived Midway were thrown into increasingly desperate battles over Guadalcanal, the Marshall Islands, and the Philippines. One by one, the remaining veterans of the glory days fell to American guns or simply disappeared over the vast Pacific. Each loss made the next battle more difficult, as inexperienced pilots tried to fill the shoes of fallen aces. Admiral Yamamoto himself would not live to see the war's end. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters, guided by intercepted radio messages, shot down his transport plane over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor died as he had lived, a victim of superior American intelligence and tactical execution. His death symbolized the fate of the Navy he had built and the empire he had served. The Battle of Midway had revealed fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking that went beyond tactical errors or intelligence failures. The assumption that American morale would crack under the weight of losses, the belief that one decisive battle could determine the war's outcome, the failure to appreciate the enemy's industrial capacity. All of these miscalculations had their roots in cultural attitudes that proved fatal in a global conflict. By war's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was a memory. The carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack were gone, their aircraft rusting on the ocean floor, and their crews long dead. The Zero fighters that had once swept enemy aircraft from the sky were being shot down by American pilots flying superior aircraft. The empire of the rising sun was setting, and the flames of Midway had marked the beginning of its decline. The admirals who had dreamed of Japanese hegemony in the Pacific had discovered that courage, skill, and tactical brilliance were insufficient. Weapons against an enemy that possessed all of these qualities plus superior resources, better intelligence, and the determination to fight a long war. The limits they found at Midway were not just tactical or operational. They were the limits of what Japan could achieve in a conflict that had grown beyond its capacity to win. In the end, the Battle of Midway became a metaphor for the entire Pacific War, a struggle in which Japanese expertise and dedication proved inadequate against American industrial might and strategic patience. The fire that consumed the Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, had been kindled by the flames of Pearl Harbor, but it burned with the fuel of American determination and the oxygen of overwhelming material superiority. The admirals, who had struck the first blow of the Pacific War, had written the beginning of their own defeat in the smoke and flames of Midway Atoll.